Hello, Jeando.
Good morning.
Last few videos, we've been talking about conscious coordination and what conscious coordination is. So to help people understand this, it would be good to talk about what conscious coordination is not, and maybe some examples of what that would be.
Yes, exactly. The way we approach labels like coordination is necessary piecemeal. It's the concept of coordination is so vast, so integrated. What I mean, every parts that are going to communicate with each other or group together in order to form the concept of coordination are very numerous. It's not easy in one video like this, in 1 hour, to say, well, this is not coordination or this is coordination. You will find that it's a dynamic concept, but most of all, it's a practical one. It's something that should help us to understand what it is we want and what it is we don't. So when we started this, exploration of the concept of coordination, I showed you a video by a very famous teacher called Wilfred Barlow. So I just want to remind you, and if you haven't seen the previous video, it's going to be important that you that we come back to this. So I'm going to share my screen, and there was this moment when the senior teacher is standing, and there is a pupil lying down on a table. And I've just a small extract of that video. And you will see that the teacher is moving the shoulder blade into what he called its natural position. Well, I do not believe there is a natural position for the shoulder, but what we can see is that, yes, there is a definite movement of the shoulder. And what the person that is lying down will not really realize is that when the teacher is performing the readjustment of the shoulder to its supposedly natural position, the shoulder is moving relatively to the rib cage, it's moving relatively to the neck, and it's moving relatively to the head. And so it's important to understand here that this readjustment is motivated by an idea that was developed by F.M. Alexander, the founder of this technique. This idea is explained in the second book, Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual. It's a whole chapter called Illustration, where he's going to describe a procedure, or he called it exercise before, and it's the exercise of hands on the back of a chair. And it all starts with this idea of widening the arms while supporting and raising the body. So widen the arms while supporting and raising the body is a sub-part of that chapter. And it starts the explanation of the hands on the back of a chair procedure. So it's easy to understand that the hands on the back of a chair procedure has one goal, among many others, but one goal, which is to explore what Alexander means by supporting and raising the body. So when he starts a chapter, the first thing is a disclaimer. And he talks about a list of instruction that is set down in this page, and he said it's the most deceptive of the list of instructions set down in these pages. And he says, in the first place, if carried out without manipulative assistance, it is a contradictory instruction, saying that if you widen the arms, as the act is generally understood, the body would be lowered, not raised, raising the body with the arms, supporting the body with the arms. So my first reaction to that statement, as I do not teach with what Alexander called manipulative assistance, is that his reasoning is not up to standard here. Of course, I agree with him that widening the upper part of the arm could be seen as a contradictory instructions, because at first, most people have no idea of what Alexander calls support. And the concept of coordinated support does not exist in normal understanding. It's a construction, and it's necessary, well, to explain what is a coordinated support in order to understand the list of instructions and the aim of that list of instruction. So I already showed you that I agree with the concept of widening of the upper part of the arm. And I showed you one of my students, that has been working with me, to show that, yes, there is a different organization of the torso relatively to the mechanism of the arms. I consider that the shoulders are part of the mechanism of the arms, which is a different mechanism that is linked with the mechanism of the torso. On the anatomical side, it's linked only with one little bone. There is one little bone that joins the mechanism of the arm with the mechanism of the torso. It's the clavicle bone. So as you can see, when the person starts to organize the movements of the mechanism of the arm relatively to the movements of the parts of the torso without any manipulative assistance. Or if there is manipulative assistance, yes, I agree, there is some manipulative assistance, but not in the meaning of most somatic teachers who understand manipulative assistance as the assistance provided by the manipulation of the teacher upon the student. Of course, these students receive manipulative assistance, but not in that sense. We were hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from each other when we had our sessions. So there was no manipulative assistance in the sense of touching and moving the parts for the pupil, like Mr. Barlow is doing on the left. On the right, the manipulative assistance was providing definite instructions to direct the movements of the different parts of the different mechanisms all together at the same time. That is, what do we want to have in mind? What sort of intentions of movement can we represent in our mind prior to performing these instructions all together? And this is what the young student is showing. And so when he, actively organizes coordination this way, we can see that the clavicle bones have completely changed their orientation. When the upper part of the arm are going away from one another, there is something you will see. It's unmissable if you want. If you know what you're looking for, if you understand widening the upper part of the arm, you will understand that there is only one solution to widen the upper part of the arm, is to change the trajectory of the clavicle bones. The clavicle bones have a fixed end. Well, they are jointed with the top of the sternum here, yeah. And the other extremity is near the top of the shoulder blade. So to narrow the distance between the two upper part of the arms, there is only one way. It's to lift the extremity, the free extremity of the clavicle, and bring them backward relatively to the front of the torso. Conversely, mechanically, if you want to realize what is meant by widening the upper part of the arm away from one another, there is also only one geometrical solution. That is to get the upper part of the arm very far forward so that the clavicles are not pressing anymore on the rib wall, and to get them to rotate, well, forward and slightly downward. I suspect that this was part of Alexander's understanding, because when he's explaining how to direct the upper parts of the arm away from one another to support the torso, this is what he says. The teacher's aim is now to give the pupil the experiences necessary to a gentle forearm pull from the fingers. And to this end, he will take hold of the pupil's elbows and direct them outwards and slightly downwards. And following this, we'll give the sensory experiences required in directing the upper part of the arms above the elbow away from one another, the right arm toward the right and the left arm toward the left, in such a way that the pupil will be supporting the torso with the arm. I will come back to the concept of supporting the torso in the arms when you, succeed in, creating the experiences necessary to the pull from the fingers, from the elbow, away from the torso, slightly downwards and forward. But for the moment, you start to see that the teacher, the manipulative teacher, the one that is touching the pupils, like Alexander was touching his pupils. So let's imagine Wilfred Barlow. So Wilfred Barlow takes hold of the pupil's elbow, he takes hold of the upper part of the arm, and it's absolutely clear that he directs them outward and slightly downward. If you understand that outward is a direction that represents a relationship with the thoracic wall. It's outward, away from the central axis of the torso. That is what outward means. Going inward would mean going toward the central axis. There are different ways. You can go toward the central axis by lifting the shoulders, or by bringing the shoulders closer together, narrowing the front. So it's obvious that when we widen the upper part of the arm away from one another, we want neither of these movements. We don't want to lift the shoulders, and we don't want to, in fact, narrow the front by, in fact, widening the back and shortening the front at the same time. So we have here very clear indications, and it's using these very clear indications that I, in fact, instructed the student to direct the movement of the arms relatively to the movement of the torso. This student is using, for example, the direction of the tip of the elbows, is at the moment directing the movement of the tip of the elbows against or antagonistically to the movements of the different parts of the torso. Is going forward and outward with the tip of the elbow, at the same time that is going backward and inward with the lowest ribs on the side of the torso. There is a clear opposition of movement, one rotation of the rib cage that is rotating backward at the lower part, up and forward at the top, while, of course, the tip of the elbow and the shoulders are going in the opposite direction. This has an effect, certainly that the pupil is experiencing an increased tension in the shoulder, because the shoulder is going away both of the torso and of the head. Look how close, even in the arm that has been manipulated, how short are the muscles of the neck. The person is clearly still lifting the shoulder if you compare with the fall of the shoulder that you can see a student of conscious guidance and control can obtain on his own. So this does not give you much about why is it that there is more coordinated support on the right than on the left. that it has not explained what is coordinated support at all. You are just seeing that the person is wearing his shoulder further out and further down relatively to the head and to the torso. Of course, the muscles of the neck are much wider. The muscle at the front of the torso are also much wider. There is less constriction and restriction, as you can see on the left side. So I thought that it was necessary to investigate, and my attention has been drawn to a video. It's a YouTube video, and you can see it here. If you type these letters and numbers in the YouTube search, you will find this video which called HG location sitting. HG location sitting is a video that has been created very recently. I think it's in April, and it's a German teacher of the modern Alexander technique that has made that video. And what she's talking about, well, what is her idea? Her idea is quite common, because there are some parts of the Alexander technique that are very interested in locations. So she's talking of the hip joint location in the gesture of going from standing to sitting. That's what the video is about. But to start with, when she's making the presentation, I just noticed that obviously, you look at a teacher of movement, a teacher of coordination, and we are discussing supporting the torso with the arm, and she's got the hands on her pelvis, on the lower part of the torso. But what is quite interesting that you must note is that I did not make any adjustment on the photograph. I am just showing that when she's standing, the coordination between the movement of the mechanism of the arm and the coordination of the mechanism of the torso is exactly what we do not want. And I will try and explain that in this, expression of her technique, there is no coordinated support whatsoever. And it's absolutely obvious that the arms are not used in order to support the body, to support the torso. So when you look at this, you will find that I have made different marks. So there is the marks for the clavicles, and we see that the top of the clavicles is very much higher than the lower part of the clavicle. So in order to obtain that stance, the teacher must make some movements. There must be movements, and there must be movement, of course, of the elbows and shoulders, but there must be also movements of the torso. In order to obtain that orientation of the clavicle, it's absolutely necessary to bring what you would call the shoulder, the extremity, the free extremity of the clavicle. It's necessary to have the free extremity of the clavicle backward. And what is important, maybe you can't see it here, but I will show you a side view. When you will see a side view, you will see that in order to lift the arms like this, and she's clearly pulling the tips of the elbow backwards relatively to the middle torso, you will find that in order to obtain that posture, she's coordinating the movement of the lower rib cage forward. That is, her abdomen is forward of the upper parts of the arm. And so here is the what I see when I look at the person from the side. Here is explain what the video is about. She's saying, that is a transcript of the video. She's saying, make up your mind before you sit down. Locate your hip joints. And she's, as you see, tapping the center of her forehead with the index finger. Of course, this is not part of the transcript. That's why it's in bracket. And you say, when you're going to sit down, I am going to fold here. I am folding down here. While she's repeating, I'm folding down here, I think it's to differentiate between the conception of the movement and the intention. The intention, I am going to fall here. But then apparently, it's not absolutely clear whether it's sufficient for her. I think that's what she thinks. It's sufficient for her to have the intention to direct the folding at some point, at some location. And therefore, the person is going to fall down here. My experience goes against that statement, against that link. You know, it's not because you have the intention to, or you think in your mind that you want to fall in some location, that you are going to be seen to fall on that location when you're going to perform the act. The necessary training of learning to transform instructions into performance, the bridging the gap between theory and practice, that's how Alexander defines it, well, is not met here. It's not because you think that you're falling, or you feel that you're falling somewhere in some location, that you're falling down there. Nevertheless, what I see is that, as I said earlier, when looking from the side, we observe that, yes, the upper part of the arm is set very far backward relatively to, of course, the lower rib cage, the top of the abdomen. So you would say that if you're looking at the person from the side, the first question you ask yourself is, what is forward? Which mechanism and which part of the mechanism is forward? And there is something absolutely obvious, is that here, the top of the abdomen, the lower rib cage, is much, much further forward than the upper part of the arm. Imagine hands on the back of a chair with the abdomen forward, yeah? You've never seen it, and for a reason. It's because, of course, when Alexander says, direct the elbows forward and slightly downward. Well, on this picture, you will see that the elbows are forward and slightly downward relatively to the shoulder, for example. Yes, but that makes no change, no sense. Yes, there is no widening of the upper part of the arm because we know that the shoulders are much higher than the top of the sternum. So it means that the clavicle are, well, incorrectly placed. It's impossible to widen the front in that way. It's impossible to widen the upper part of the arm. The neck is so short, the distance between, for example, the mastoid process, which is where the head is resting on the spine, and the shoulder is so short. It's as if to lift the little finger toward the head, because it's a gesture she makes to, in fact, stress what she's saying at that moment. You make up your mind. So she's clearly indicating the top of the head. There must be something there where the mind should be, I think. That's why she's doing the gesture. But when she's doing the gesture, it's absolutely obvious that she's lifting the shoulder in order to do it. She's really narrowing the front in order to touch her head. It's a choice. Is it a conscious choice? I am not so sure. But certainly you understand now that directing the tip of the elbow forward and slightly downwards, and having the experience done time and time again, because I think that as a teacher of stat, she must have had that manipulation time and time again. So contrary to what Alexander is saying, manipulative assistance does nothing to help understand what Alexander is talking about. Because for me, having the tip of the elbow forward and slightly downwards relatively, for example, to the shoulder or to the head means nothing. It's absolutely not what we want. We absolutely see that because the shoulders are very, very far back, her abdomen is very far forward of her ankle. Therefore, she's shortening the back, protruding the abdomen, and unduly protruding the rib cage, the shoulder blades backward relatively to the rib cage. So there is another way, and it's what's missing in Alexander's instructions, is I agree with the idea of tip of the elbow forward and slightly downwards. Yes, but not relatively to a physical experience that she's supposed to have. She hasn't got at the moment the exact definite instruction, and it's obvious that it could be changed very simply by saying that we want the movement of the tip of the elbow forward and slightly downward relatively to the lowest ribs on the side of the torso. And then we would have a very interesting opposition, because she would have, if she was to think of an intention of moving the lowest ribs relatively to the elbow, she would move the lowest ribs, of course, backward, what Alexander called back, without more, precision, so that nobody could understand. Nobody could understand the experience they were having. It's not because you have an experience of something that you have an understanding. Most of the time, what you have is a very strong sensory stimulus. Oh dear, the teachers has organized me. I could not understand anything, but I felt absolutely brilliant. Well, at the moment, I do not judge. I do think that the teacher feels brilliant. At the end of his session, she said that if you start, locating your hip joint going into sitting, you will feel absolutely marvelous. Well, it's a statement. I don't know if what relevance there is in feeling absolutely marvelous in locating the hip joint in sitting, when I see that in standing, well, the location of the hip joint is of no import, because it's obvious for me that in standing, she's got the hip joint very far forward of both the support, well, Alexander called the ankle the fulcrum. She's very far forward of the fulcrum, and also her hips are very far forward of the upper part of the torso. Therefore, well, she's arching the spine. And she's having her balance on the front of the foot. I want to compare with this video that we were discussing about Wilfred Barlow working with a new student. And so after 31 minutes of work with that student on the table, where I gave her the experience of widening the upper part of the arm, of course, immediately after the first 31 minutes, we see that the student is coming in front of the chair, and the position of the shoulder is back where they belong. Well, it's back according to the habits of movements of that person. So seeing how high the shoulders are relatively to the ear, I can tell you that the clavicle free ends are again very high in space relatively to the top of the sternum. The person is again narrowing the upper part of the arm toward each other. She's narrowing the upper part of the arm. And as you can see, the elbows are very far backward relatively to the lower rib cage, to the top of the abdomen. Again, we see that the person has no conception of an opposition of movements. The person is talking certainly about an experience. She has had an experience of the location of the shoulder. But the location of the shoulder, for me, is a concept exactly like the location of the hip is a concept that is absolutely not useful. The somatic teachers are always talking about positions. Well, of course, they certainly not approve, or they will certainly disagree with me when I say this. But there is a difference in concepts between a location and a coordination. You will see that the location of the shoulder or the location of the hip is the result of the different movements that the person is performing. It's obvious that in order to stand in this way, these two persons have, well, given consent to a movement of the lower torso forward of the fulcrum. And as well, these two subjects have given consent to a movement of the upper torso backward. Therefore, the person is arching the spine, shortening the spine, reducing the internal breathing capacity. Yeah. And so this is the statement of the senior teacher. He says a line from a mastoid should go through a hip and through an ankle. Well, you may think that it's what I've done. I've taken a mastoid spot, a hip spot, and the fulcrum. I didn't take even, yes, the ankle, yeah. And so what is not said in that sentence is the characteristic of the line. Or maybe it's obvious to most of you that it's a rectilinear line or a bent line. What is it? So for me, my conception of it is that the statement is correct if you add that the line must be rectilinear, one line. Yeah, at the moment, I've got two lines. I've got what I would call a broken line. So for me, an unbroken line is a continuous rectilinear line. And at the moment, the coordination of movements of the different parts results in, well, you remember the idea that the balance should be on the back of the foot. That's what was said by Mr. Barlow just before explaining what he meant. He wanted the balance to be not on the front of the foot, but on the back of the foot. And when I look at these two pictures, well, there is a similarity. It seems that a complete novice and a trained teacher have the same tendency, the tendency to protrude the abdomen, arch the spine, and raise the shoulders. Therefore, there is a difficulty when you think that Alexander, well, clearly indicates that manipulative assistance is going to help the pupil realize what the orders are about. Well, apparently, winding the upper part of the arm away from one another is not part of the modern Alexander technique arsenal of orders, of instructions. Yes, and the result is exactly opposite to the one we want. Is Wilfred Barlow, when he says that the line should go through the hip and through the ankle, he's not explaining how to stand. He's not explaining how to bend. Or how to stand by, is not telling us how to relate the movement of the different parts to each other. When we are talking about the natural place or natural position of the shoulder, or when we are talking about the position of the hip, we are thinking statically. A position is not a coordination of movement. It is the outcome. It is the result. It is the end. The means whereby are the different movements that applied to the different, of course, bony part of the structure are going to obtain that position. So saying to the students, to, well, lay people, if you know where your hips are, if you locate in your mind your hips, you will be fine in sitting. Well, this theory is really difficult to accept. It's necessary to watch the images and understand what we are talking about in order to go further in this. So, supporting the torso. Once the teachers has organized the shoulders so that we have a widening of the upper part away from one another. This is what Alexander adds. The pupil will now be asked to continue to support the torso in this way. The question is the student or pupil clear about what Alexander means by supporting the torso in this way? He's asked to continue to rehearse his orders. Are we sure that he's understanding what he's rehearsing? Or are these just words that should, well, at first not be understood, but just accompany the feeling experience? Whilst the teacher so adjusts the torso that the large lifting muscle of the back will be employed coordinately with the other parts of the organism in bringing about such use of the respiratory mechanism that they will function to the maximum at a particular stage of development reached from day to day. This is all very strange, I can tell you, because once the pupil has well, created the different coordination of movement that will, well, show us that is supporting the torso with the arms, I can't see what is the point for the teacher to adjust the torso to the large lifting muscle of the back. It's as if supporting the torso with the arms was independent of the different movements of the parts of the torso. It's as if that after supporting the torso, the teacher has to organize the torso. Well, he has to organize the large lifting muscle of the back. You must understand what Alexander is talking about when he says large lifting muscles of the back. He's talking of the latissimus dorsi. Latissimus. Alexander makes that absolutely clear in that chapter. Yeah, I'm not inventing it. It's written black on white. The largest lifting muscle are, well, latissimus dorsi means the largest muscle of the back. And you must ask yourself, when the manipulative assistance is given so that we have the elbows directed outward and slightly downwards. Well, the teacher is providing experiences. Is it not for the pupil being able to create the experiences by herself? That's my point. So the pupil should be able to direct the movement of the elbows and direct them outward and slightly downwards relatively to the mechanism of the torso. And you must ask yourself, when the person has the hands on the table, on the chair, sorry, and directs the movement of the elbows outward and slightly downwards, which are the movements, which is powering the movements? You must understand that to direct the elbows slightly outward and slightly downward, well, there must be an opposition between the muscle of the back, the latissimus dorsi. The latissimus dorsi is going to pull the elbow downwards, and there must be other muscles that are going to oppose the direction of movement. And when you oppose the movement, because when you have the hands on the back of a chair and you start, well, activating the latissimus dorsi, the first thing that will happen is that, of course, the hands cannot move down. You must understand that the latissimus dorsi pulls the elbows down from the lower back. That's the function of the latissimus dorsi. Pull the muscle of the elbows. Okay, but you will see that the direction outward of the elbow is a direction that is directly opposite to the pull of the latissimus dorsi. You can manage to activate the latissimus dorsi quite strongly without the elbow seeming to go inward. You can ask the pupil to make that experiment, rest the hands on the, or grab the hand, the back of a chair with the hands, and then suddenly decide to pull the elbows down. you will see that immediately you can pull your elbow down. Well, now make another experiment where you think I can direct the tip of the elbow away from the shoulders, away from the ribs, outward and slightly downward. You will see that this is possible also. It's so possible that it will have a tendency to rotate the wrist outwards. So Alexander says, no, do not let the wrist rotate outward. Maintain the wrist rotation inward. So he's asking you now to engage another type of muscles that is maintaining the wrist toward themselves while you really pull on the tip of the elbows outward. But when you combine these intentions of movements together, you will see that the tendency is to exert a pull on the upper part of the arm away from the rib cage, opening the front of the torso. But what is important is that when you activate the latissimus dorsi, a muscle that is pulling the elbows down, well, the elbows are not going down. If you activate the latissimus dorsi is going to continue to pull on both ends. As the end that I call tip of the elbow is not moving down, what is going to happen is that the other part, lower back, is going to be raised. Raising the torso with the arm, supporting the torso with the arm. So when we are discussing support, there is a big misunderstanding very often, because most people would say at first that if you want support, you have to organize the movements of the bones. I agree. On this picture, what we see is that the bones of the legs are not affected and influenced correctly by the force of gravity. When you see a structure like this, is the Pisa Tower. It's falling forward. The whole weight of the upper and middle torso are acting on the front of the fulcrum. The person is collapsing forward. Yeah. So when the person is collapsing forward with the middle torso like this, it's necessary for the upper torso to maintain the balance going back. Therefore, we get a broken line of support. But Alexander does not think exactly like that. For him, the concept of coordinated support is slightly more complex. There is, of course, an idea that getting support from the stack of the rigid structure of the bony parts, certainly. But what he's explaining when he's discussing supporting the torso in this way is not supporting the torso through a stack of bones. We are not having the bones of the arms directed straight down to support the torso. No, support in this sense is the support you get from cables. It's the support you get from ropes. It's the support you get from elastic structure and tissues. Coordinated support is something that will use the different tissues of the body, stretching them in order to expand. The expansion of the torso is the support of the torso. Well, that's how I'm looking at it. So the idea of position, that the hip are not in position to have a correct stack. Well, on this picture, why not? I would agree with that idea, but it's not Alexander's idea. Alexander's idea is that if the person is using the muscles of the leg in this way to project the lower torso forward, yeah, she has to maintain our balance, to use the shoulders very far back, use the upper torso very far back. When the upper torso is very far back, of course, the cervical spine is pulled backward. Therefore, it's impossible to have the head forward and up. The head is backward relatively to the middle torso. And therefore, there is no coordinated support because there is no expansion of the cables, the ligaments, the fascia, the ropes that elastically could maintain the torso and sustain the torso. It's properly absent. And when he's discussing spinal curvature, that's what he's saying. There are, for him, two factors. There is the bent or curved spine, and therefore shortened, and the decreased internal capacity of the thoracic cavity. These are quite interesting because he's clearly relating the support with, well, absence of support in this case, with, well, two aspects, A and B, not just A. So when you are starting to think about coordinated support, which are the movements which could create antagonistic pulls in the ropes and springs and every elastic tissue in the body? How could I move the different parts to obtain? Well, you start to understand then that when you observe the person, of course, I agree with this teacher that directing the movement at the hip is important. Alexander is talking about directing the hip as far back as is possible. So I need to slightly change his statement, because once again, when you say directing the hip, it's as if you're directing a location. It's much better when we give lessons to, in fact, make sure that we are very clear and we have a very strong discipline of language. We are directing the movement of the hip. We are not directing the hip. We are not directing a location. We are directing movements. And so I do agree with this teacher that if she accepts directing the movement of the hips, I would say that this is correct. And it's correct because we know that the hip joint is part of, well, the lower torso main bone, which is the pelvis. And that is important because the pelvis is attached to the spine. Depending on the movement of that lower torso bone, you're going to bend or lengthen the spine. Well, now, yes, but if you accept this idea, well, then you are confronted with a very big difficulty, that just directing the movement of the hip will never provide coordinated support. Because remember, coordinated support means lengthening the spine, expanding the thoracic capacity, A and B. Well, now what we see here is that there is not only the lower torso that is articulated with the spine, there is the whole rib cage. I've made a collage here so that you can get some sort of idea of what it is we can see that we do not touch. But immediately when you watch a video, you can start to imagine what are the mechanisms, movements. How are the movements of the different parts of the mechanisms organized? And we see the unduly lifted chest. There is no question that the sternum is inclined backward at the top. If the sternum is inclined backward at the top, then we have a definite relation. That's what Alexander is saying here. A little consideration will show that any alteration in the spine must necessarily affect the position and working of the ribs. The thoracic capacity, the thoracic elasticity, the thoracic movements depends on the position of the spine. On the other hand, we see that by increasing the thoracic capacity, and so increasing the distance between the ends of these ribs, we are applying a mechanical principle which by reverse action tend to straighten the spine. Yes, when the teacher is standing, she's directing the movements of the ribs. I would say more or less consciously or subconsciously. Because if she directs the movement of the first rib and the top of the sternum so far backward, she must understand that the vertebrae that is directly linked with it, well, there is a unique degree of freedom. It's only possible for that rib to rotate around the first thoracic vertebrae. If the rib is going back, then what happens is that the first thoracic goes back. If the rib goes forward, it's obvious that the first thoracic will go forward. In this case, it's obvious to me that the direction of the first rib is toward the back, and the direction of the lowest ribs is toward the front. That's how you protrude the abdomen. This is the only way. The coordination of the movement to obtain the protruding abdomen, the unduly lifted shoulders, and the lowered back are all shown here. Yeah, there is a definite movement for the ribs. There is a definite movement for the pelvis. And these definite movements create, well, the shortening of the back, and they create also, well, the reducing of the thoracic capacity. Alexander is talking about the free end of the ribs. I think I will come back to this because very often the students have a difficulty understanding that sentence. So I will translate it in our next video, I think. What it is to direct the movement of the ribs, you will see it's not only directing the movement. For example, the smallest ribs, we want them forward. The longest rib, we want them back in order to lengthen the back. But there is also another possibility, as Alexander said. It's possible to extend the distance between the free end of the ribs to expand the thoracic capacity. It's not sufficient to just lengthen the spine. There is the B condition that has to be met. It's also necessary to, well, expand the thoracic cage. I will show you this. So I will show you this, but I will come back to this necessity of understanding that the location of a joint is never going to provide immediate coordination. It's not because you are directing your attention toward a location. She's placing her fingers at a certain height to make herself like feel the height of the location of the hip joint. This is the purpose of this hand. Go and watch the video. You will see it's quite clear. And she's going to start a bending movement using just this. But you will find that the unduly lifted upper chest, the retracted neck, and of course, the protruding abdomen and the shortened back are going to be there from the start of the bending to the end. Therefore, thinking of the location of the hip is never going to create a coordination of the whole. So coordinated support is not trying to get a stack. It's not trying to get a location. It's to create antagonistic pulls so that we have a new use of the, of course, elastic tissues of the body to support the torso with the legs and with the arm in order to lengthen the back and increase the thoracic capacity. I think that's it for yourself for today.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Jeando. So for people watching the video, you'll find a link underneath to Jeando and his email address if you'd like to book a lesson with him. And we will see you in the next video. Thanks, Jeando.
Thanks, Kevin.